Welcome back. Mark here again with Exotic Car Play Place. And today we're going to look at the debate of buying an Egear Lamborghini Gallardo versus buying a manual Gallardo. Now, what you'll find, you've probably seen a lot of people talking on the forums about the pluses and minuses to buying either or. Now, buying an Egear transmission car is easy. Why? Because there's lots of them. There's lots of those cars around. You can find plenty anywhere you look. I would say the vast majority of, particularly the early Gallardos, are still Egear transmissions. Finding a manual transmission is actually kind of rare. It's kind of tough to find. Now, you'll also notice if you've been shopping for these cars that the manual transmission cars seem to be calling for a wee bit of a premium. Now, there's probably various reasons for that, some of which, to be quite frank, in my opinion, is based on perception. And what's that perception caused by? Well, there's a perception that the manual transmission is a better car. And I think we can all agree, for the most part, if you do enough research and just understand the bare fact of why is every other supercar today going towards an automated manual? Why? Because it shifts quicker, it's easier to use, and at the end of the day, it's more based on performance and throwing down hard numbers. So that's why everybody's going to these automated manuals. Now, the early Gallardos are a single clutch. The modern day stuff is twin clutch, and that's okay. Functionality is very much the same. That's why we go to the automated manuals today. The manual transmission, on the other hand, is kind of throwing back to the past. Where the argument comes in for the manual transmission is the fact that they state that you get a better driving experience. The experience in driving a manual transmission is irreplaceable. It's you, the man, the machine, and you can't replace that with any kind of automation. Well, I'm here to argue that fact. I've driven manual transmissions all my life, and I have previously purchased my Gallardo and have now been converted. Yeah, I really enjoy a manual transmission. The gated shifter is an awesome thing. The click, 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 the sound of shifting. It's still a lot of fun to drive, don't get me wrong. However, when you drive a Egear car in sport mode and you're pulling the gears, revving it, accelerating hard through the gears, accelerating and shifting, it is absolutely a joy and an amazing experience. I could not wipe the grin off my face. The first time I drove my Gallardo, and I drove it in sport mode in particular, the upshifts and the downshifts are phenomenal. The downshifts also, that's something you can't replicate with the manual gearboxes. The downshifts, if you've ever had the experience, you'll know that a downshift, the way Lamborghini times their shifting, it actually does a blip and it gives you this barking sound. And that's kind of what they always refer to the Lambo as, they bark as you're downshifting. Just an awesome sound. Very difficult to duplicate downshifting with a manual and get it right. So the actual driving experience, I would argue that the Egear car is actually a better experience. Now, the manual transmission is great, don't get me wrong. Again, I've driven them all my life, manual cars that is, and having driven a manual Gallardo, I can attest to the fact that they are a lot of fun, but the Egear, for sheer driving, performance, speed of acceleration, hands down, it goes to the Egear transmission. Now, the other part, there's another big piece of this puzzle, is the rarity. Even on sheer collectability, some claim that the manual transmission is actually going up in value, where the Egear cars are going down in value. Well, see, that's a piece on perception. In my opinion, I think a lot of people feel this way. Obviously not everyone feels this way. This is my take on this. Perception states that because of its rarity and because of its superior quality and basically superior reliability, that what you're going to find is that car is going to be worth far more money in the future. Now, build numbers might help that a little bit, But the other factors, such as the reliability and the quality, not a chance. There's nothing superior about it. Yeah, it's a simple system. There's less to break. It doesn't mean it's cheaper to maintain and operate. Why do I say that? Well, take a look at some catalogs here. Just browse a little bit on the internet and you'll find it won't take very long to discover the pricing on these parts for both of these types of setups. Now, if you look, the clutches for both of these Egear and the manual transmission cars are very similar. You're, a few $1,000s for a clutch kit, give or take, for both the Egear and the manual transmission. That's great. Not cheap, but nonetheless very comparable. Yes, there's more moving parts. Actuators can go on Egears, and that's a big dollar part. However, there have been benefits lately to the creativity of aftermarket people that say, you know what, there's got to be other options. Now there are optional rebuild kits. You can do a rebuild on the pumps or on the actuators for a lot less money than you ever could before, because a new actuator is not cheap. The actuator itself is not as big a concern as it once was, where you might face a $15,000 to $20,000 bill to replace an actuator. Now you can do it for a couple or a few $1,000s. You can get your actuator rebuilt, cleaned up and built and set up and put back in your car, and it can be just like new. Now you have the Egear pump as well, which is not huge money. You might be looking at $1,000 or a couple grand for that. And that's a possibility. An Egear pump is another option, another item that could go wrong. That's the pump that you hear all the time. When you open the door on the Egear cars, you'll hear that buzz when you open the car. That's the pump. When you know the pump is going, that noise will become intermittent or non-existent altogether. It's pretty easy diagnosis. There will be other symptoms with that, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we are going to talk about is effectively, why is that Egear car such a problem? Why is it such a dud according to the car lovers or according to the manual Gallardo lovers? Well, basically, aside from the actuator, which has a general solid reliability, and the pump, which is not all that expensive to replace, what is the offset costs in buying an Egear versus a manual? Well, yeah, there are some additional costs in potentially owning an Egear. However, when you do a clutch change, it's always in your best interest, and you'll talk to most mechanics will say this. Doing a clutch change, you're always going to inspect the rear main seal, and not only that, you're likely going to change the throwout bearing, or the release bearing, in other words. So the throwout bearing is a bearing that is mounted behind all the hardware. You can get at it once you do the clutch. You'll know what I'm talking about. But that bearing on an Egear car is actually $800 and some dollars, $800, $900 US to buy a new throwout bearing for an Egear car. Do you know what the cost is for a manual transmission? Try between $4,000 and $5,000 for the throwout bearing for a manual car. So when you're doing a clutch, it doesn't take very long to figure out that some of those costs are quickly offset by the cost of buying some of the other parts, i.e. the release bearing or the throwout bearing. So now the costs for maintenance on a clutch become far closer. When you're looking at an Egear versus a manual, the clutch costs actually are arguably quite a bit more on the manual car if you're doing the proper job. Yeah, there's always the quick and dirty, throw a new flywheel and disc in there and leave the rest alone. That's not the way to do it. If you want to do it right, you'll look at the rear main seal, you'll change the throwout bearing, you'll put a new clutch in there, and you'll be good for another probably 20 to 30,000 miles. Now, that is the main offset. That's the argument that I've seen time and time again, is the simplicity and the cost of maintenance. Simplicity, yes, on the manual. Cost of maintenance, not as much as you think. Egears probably are not cheaper to maintain than a manual, but they're not way more money. inherently the manual or the Egear cars are not as unreliable as some people portray them to be. Some have failed, some of these failures. Yeah, the odd car sees an Egear line failure. The odd car will have a pump that stops. The really odd car will actually have a actuator failure. That's kind of rare, can happen. But generally, for the most part, these things are all optional things. These things are all partially likely to happen. And at the end of the day, what really does the experience boil down to? The ownership experience, that is. As far as I'm concerned, I'm here not to tell you which is better. I'm not here to say an Egear car is far superior. I'm not here to say the manual is far superior. I originally looked for a manual and I thought, you know what, I want the manual car and I will not buy a Gallardo until I get my hands on a manual one. I started test driving, and once I got behind the wheel of these cars, it actually changed my mind very quickly, that I actually decided, you know what, I don't need a manual. Maintenance costs aside, I don't need a manual transmission car per se. Wouldn't mind having one, but I don't need to have one. So I ended up buying an Egear. Do I regret it? Not a chance. I think they're great cars, they're a lot of fun. There is only one thing that I can say that is truly an obvious benefit to owning the manual. And that is, this is part of the maintenance and reliability part of it. And that really boils down to, with an Egear car, if your wear becomes down to a certain point and you hit that minimum point of wear that is available left on your disc, the car will not engage into gear. And the plus to having a manual in that situation is if you actually have a car that even have a bad clutch, a clutch that's slipping, you can get that car home. You can probably slip your way home, get the car to the shop, get the car home, wherever you need to get it to, you can probably limp the car home. The downside with the Egear, once it says, you know what, I don't have enough space, I don't have enough wear on this disc, it says, no, piss on it. I'm going to stop right here and you're going to spend the $500 to ship me to the nearest Lamborghini shop. So that's the downside in owning the Egear car. In my opinion, the only thing that I can see is the potential practicality of, you know, managing the car under that kind of failure mode. The other thing, of course, being, you know, when you're doing a clutch, you got to set up the test equipment that can read the Lamborghini software, and that can adjust the clutch settings, like the pickup point, like the point of slip, for example, POS, and there's other points and parts that you may have to readjust when you're looking at some of these elements. So that's really the only other part. You really do need a shop to look at. Somebody who's got the parts and the computer that can read that. You really do need that to properly reset and set up your clutch when you have an Egear car. So that's really the only downside that I can see. Aside from that, the reliability is not a whole lot less. The maintenance costs could be marginally more, but it's not the horror story most people will try to tell you. And performance-wise, it's a far, far better experience driving the Egear car. So the only other thing, and you know what, the manual car is not great either, but engaging the car into first, getting rolling at slow speeds, city driving, the Egear car actually is a little bit of a pain in the ass. I'm not going to lie. Taking off from a red light or inching through traffic in busy rush hour traffic is disgusting. It's horrible in an Egear car. It's not a whole lot better in a manual though, although it is a little bit better because you can kind of regulate that, and you can probably control a wear a little bit better yourself if you're driving a manual in slow traffic. I mean, if you just play it right, you can probably control that a bit better. Whereas the Egear car, it's giving you what it's giving you, and it's slipping a lot, and you know what? That's where it becomes a bigger issue. So that's kind of the crappy part of driving the Egear car, is in slow, inchy traffic. So again, if I could summarize what we talked about from the beginning, this really boils down to a question of what is your use for the car and what is your personal preference. because they both have great benefits. They are both great experiences, and I would not shy from either of them. I know there are people that would not even touch an Egear with a 50-foot pole. There's people also that think manuals are kind of old school and need the Egear just to feel like they're kind of in the modern day car. Either way you go, they're both great choices. Both experiences were awesome, and you really can't go very wrong with either of them. So I hope you like this video. Again, as always, give me a like and also subscribe to my channel. My channel, I'm going to be talking a lot more about specifically my Lamborghini, which is an early pre-LP Gallardo, and there's going to be many more videos on it. There's going to be videos on other supercars. I also review other cars, because not just supercars, but cars that people find interesting. It may not be an exotic, but it would be a car that a car lover loves. So I do review other cars that maybe aren't considered exotics, but I do really do like to focus on the supercar aspect. So join along. Again, like, subscribe, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.